Welcome back everyone to this series of lecture videos on data input and output with pandas. In this specific lecture, we're going to be focusing on CSV files, even though we've already read in a couple of CSV files throughout the course already. As I've mentioned before, pandas can read in data from a wide variety of sources, and it has excellent online documentation on how to read in or write to these various data sources. In this series of lecture videos, we're going to be covering some of the most popular ways to read in datasets with pandas. I want to have a couple of quick notes on this. The first one, especially with CSV files, is that you need to know the exact directory location and the correct file name for reading in CSV files. For our own datasets, you can easily just run our lecture notebooks, and they are automatically configured to make sure that if you're running the lecture notebook from the original location, that all the file paths and the file names are correct. So keep that in mind. If you're ever stuck or get in trouble, you can always just unzip our file and run one of our notebooks from its original location. Another thing to note that is going to be more important later on, especially when you're dealing with things like SQL databases, is that you sometimes need passwords or permissions for certain data inputs. That one's a little harder for us to help out in because while we're not going to be dealing with any password protected data inputs, you may encounter those things at work. And if you're starting to have problems with that, you may need to contact your IT department to see if you need access or special permissions. And the final note is that in line with dealing with your own datasets, sometimes it's almost impossible for us to really help out with datasets that are outside of the course, since they could be incorrectly formatted, maybe they're in the wrong location or have a different name than what you're showing us. So in general, please only post questions in regards to reading in the data sources that we show for our course materials. For your own data sources, I'd highly suggest that you check out the online documentation, since it's almost impossible for us to debug things or data sets that we don't really know anything about. Okay, so what are the topics we're actually going to cover in the video lectures? In this lecture, we're going to cover CSV files. We pretty much read CSV files throughout the entire course, so if you're going to watch one video lecture, just make sure it's this one. And then we'll also show you a couple of other options, reading in HTML tables, Excel files, or SQL databases. We're not actually going to need to read in HTML, Excel, or SQL for the rest of the course, but they are important things and useful things to understand. So we'll go ahead and have a video for each one. Okay, let's get started and head over to a Jupyter Notebook and review not just how to read in a CSV file, but also how to save and output one. Okay, here I am in the Jupyter Notebook. As I mentioned, there's a link inside of the lecture notebook for the online resources, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. Or you can just Google search Pandas IO Guide or IO Tools, and it should take you to the link we have in the lecture notebook, Inputs and Outputs or Data Inputs and Outputs. And we can see here we have IO Tools, and this table is actually in your lecture notebook, but essentially there's the format type and the data description, and then what the command is to read it in, and what the command is to write it out. Keep in mind, not everything can be written out, but most things can be read into Pandas. So for example, for CSV, you have read CSV, and then for the writer, you have to CSV. Something to keep in mind that's a really common confusion point for beginners of Pandas is that when you're reading in a file, it's typically pd.read CSV or pd.read something, or pandas.read. And then when you're writing out to a file, you're actually writing the data frame itself. So you'll have data frame to CSV or df to CSV or df to JSON or df to Excel. So keep that in mind. It's going to be pd read versus df to. Okay, so obviously there's a lot you can work with here. There's a whole table, and if you just click on one of these, let's imagine that we are working with an HTML table. So we click read HTML, it'll take you here, and it'll actually have a little guide here on HTML table parsing in case you encounter any issues. Has a full example of how to read in HTML files, and you can continue on with more examples. So super useful stuff. And it's pretty much like that for every single item in the table. So if you get stuck on something, or you want to open something that we don't actually show you here, so for instance, we're not going to show you how to read something from Google BigQuery, but maybe you are interested in that. So you just come over here to Google BigQuery, click on Read GBQ, and it will take you to the documentation for that. And you can see here that it's actually split off into a separate package called Pandas GBQ. So then you would just pip install, click on the link, explore the documentation, and etc. You can click the link here in case you end up working with Google BigQuery, and you have all the information here. So just keep in mind the latest info is always going to be in the online documentation. But let's come back to our notebook. We're going to be dealing with .csv files. So we've already done this before, but there's two main things to understand here. It's the current working directory and then where the actual file name and where it is. Okay, so how can I find out where I'm currently working in? Well, if you're in Jupyter Notebook, you can always just type pwd into a cell and run it by itself, and it's going to report back your not just where you're located, but also the general file format structure. So in this case, I'm on a Windows computer, so to separate out directories, it's using //. If you're on something like Mac OS or Linux, it could do a single // And then if you want a list of the files in your current directory, you can do ls. And here I can see a list of my current files. So I see some CSV files, some Excel files, etc. Okay, so we've already covered this before, but again, these are just quick commands you can use inside of Jupyter to get this information. As a very quick note, if you're not using Jupyter and you prefer to run things like .py files and you still want to find out this sort of information, you can use the OS module to do this. So OS module, operating system module. You just import OS. This is separate from Pandas. It just comes built in with Python. And you say OS, and you can do something like get, and there's one called CWD for current working directory. Open and close parentheses, you run that, and that actually produces the same result. So this is for people who are not working with Jupyter and need to actually run this as a Python script. If you want to figure out what is actually inside of your directory or where you're located, you can use the OS module for that. Now, let's talk about reading in CSV files. As we already know, we can simply say pd read _. If you hit tab here, you're going to have lots of options, but right now we're working with CSV, so we'll go ahead and do that. And then inside of the pandas folder, the 03-pandas folder, there is something called example.csv. We can go ahead and read it in. I'm going to say df is equal to pd.readcsv. I run this, and let's check out this data frame. Very simple data frame. It automatically reads in the header A, B, C, D. Now keep in mind, by default, the header is inferred by Pandas. That means it goes ahead and guesses that it thinks A, B, C, and D, since they're different data types than the rest of these numbers, it should be the header. If you don't want it to be the header, and you actually want that to be a row instead of column names, you can say header is equal to none. Run that again, and what it's going to do is it's actually going to set A, B, C, D as a row entry. But for our case, typically header infer is okay, especially for the data sets we use in this course, so we're good on that here. Now, maybe you want one of these to be your index column. For example, I want A instead of a column, I want it to be an index. Well, we know that we could just say set index to A, or alternatively, what I can do here is say index _ call is equal to 0, and that just says use the 0 index column as my actual index in the data frame. So when you read it in this way, it went ahead and set A as the index. Okay, so let's imagine now we want to save this data frame. What we're going to do here is say df to _ you hit tab and you see all the options you have. You can even save it to your clipboard if you want to copy and paste this into an Excel file. But what we're going to do here is say to CSV. You put the file name you want or the actual full file path. So if I really wanted to, I could say C:\\/ user, my name, and then actually since I'm on Windows it'd be 2 backslashes, desktop, etc. And then you could say new file.csv. So that's one option. You just keep going to wherever you want to save it on your computer. Or if you want to save it to the same location that this Python is operating in, which we already know is right here underneath the pandas folder, then you don't need to provide that full file path. You can just say new file.csv. Most important thing to note here is that it will save this index. So if you wanted to save the index, you're just going to say index true. That is the default. If you don't want it to save the index, for example, let's go ahead and remove index call here and read df in again. So I can see here, df, this index, I'm always going to be able to just automatically create a 0, 1, 2, 3 index. So if you think it's not actually worth saving the index information because it's the default index of pandas, you can say index is equal to false when you're writing it to a CSV. And then when you run that, let's go ahead and read it in again. We'll say new is equal to pd read CSV. Let's read in that new file .csv. I check out new, and there we have it, the exact same information. So as a quick reminder, it's PD read and then df2. So you read various sources from your pandas, and you take your data frame and write it to other sources. That's it for CSV files. If you have any questions, definitely check out the documentation, as well as our explanations in the lecture notebook. Coming up next, we're going to talk about reading in HTML tables. I'll see you there.